Ben Anderson, who's Deputy Director of Chimera. Are you Deputy Director? Deputy Director?
No, I'm Deputy Director. Yes, that's right.
Of Chimera.
Okay, I'm going to kick off by looking backwards to look forwards. Why might I want to look backwards? Well, history can teach us things. It can teach us things about change. It can teach us things about the nature of change, and therefore where we may be going. So let's just play a little sort of thought experiment. Let's just suppose that certain things might be true. Let's suppose, for example, that the society is actually radically different from things that have gone before. If that's the case, then as we see ICT uptake sort of increasing through society over time, we should see things changing. We should be able to see things changing which we can measure. If we can measure them, then we can say something confidently about the nature of those changes. So, is this the case? Will it continue to be the case? Will things continue to change? And in the next 15 minutes or so, I'll illustrate some of the results we've got as to what is changing and how it's changing and why. In some cases, why it probably isn't. So what kind of changes might we imagine? Well, we can imagine things which are at the macro level. So, remember the 1960s, they said we'd all do less work and more leisure. Yeah, right. But as you'll see later, some people are actually doing rather less work, and not for the reasons that we might imagine. There's specific levels. People might do specific things more or less using technologies to achieve those ends. So they may do less socialising, for example, as some people claim in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Or as Paul's going to talk about later, political participation and civic volunteering. Maybe they'll do more of that, maybe they'll do less of that for different reasons. But there's also behavioural level of change. So whilst we may still do the things that we used to do, maybe the way that we do it is changing. Maybe the day-to-day lived experience of working and living with these technologies changes something about the way our life flows through the day. Caroline and Susan actually will be talking a little bit about that. And what kind of evidence might we look for if we're really interested in history? Well, of course, we need some sort of historical trend data going backwards in time so we can ask questions about what did it look like then, what's it looking like now? Are things changing from, let's say, the mid to late 1990s onwards, when some of these technologies started to play a greater role in the workplace and a much greater role in the home and the household? We can also use what's called longitudinal data, where you follow individuals or businesses or whatever over time. So you're following something to see how things change as they adopt new technologies. And that's very crucial for some kinds of analyses that we might want to do, because we don't want to confuse the fact that different people do different things with the fact that particular kinds of people change. We have to be very careful to tease those two things apart. It would also be quite handy to have some sort of behavioural data, not just attitudinal data, not just response to certain kinds of survey questions, but something that is more behavioural that we can see changing over time. Now, there are a range of ways of doing that. One of them is time use data, which is going to underpin most of the presentations we're going to talk about this afternoon. And you can collect time use data, as in how many minutes or hours do you spend doing something. You can do that in various ways. You can do it using diaries. And quite a lot of the results we'll show you are using time use diaries, where you ask people to fill in a very onerous task, which is to fill in a day or a week of what were they doing every 5 or 10, 15 minutes. You can imagine trying to complete one of those. You get a response rate of something like 30% in surveys to those sorts of things. Perhaps better when you can do it with qualitative research, which you can do alongside it. And you can also use questions in surveys which are not about diaries. It's things like, how often do you do? Now, of course, if you did a time use diary and I was interested in how often you go to the cinema, last week you might not have gone. Okay. When I asked you something like, how frequently do you go? You might say, well, it's twice a month. That's good. I can pick that up, but I couldn't have picked the other one up. So it's good to have these different kinds of data all at the same time. And you'll see some of that, particularly in Paul's talk later. Now, these things can give us estimates of behaviour over time. Now, let us assume that what we talk about in terms of going to the cinema is the same activity now as it was in the 60s. Then we can do some sorts of change measurement over time. We'll come back to whether or not it is the same kind of activity later. We can also do things like sequencing. Because we know what they're doing at 9 o'clock, at 10 past 9, at half past 9, at 10 o'clock, we can see the pattern of life throughout the day. Okay, Caroline's going to be talking a bit about that, and she and Susan are going to be talking about multitasking, the idea that whilst you're doing one thing, you can also be doing something else as well, watching television, as well as cooking dinner, for example. And those sorts of things are very well picked up with certain kinds of time use diary data, which you couldn't get any other way, in fact. And you can do measures of change. This is to do with the longitudinal data, for example. What were you doing before you got a mobile phone, and how did anything change after you got one, or did not? We'll see. And of course, otherwise we wouldn't be standing here. As luck would have it, there are such data sets around. There is a historical data set which goes back to the 1960s for a number of different countries, which University of Essex put together. Kimberly Fisher, who I think was going to come, but is unable to, at Oxford, has put together some of that data. And I've been involved in a number of longitudinal studies, more recently, from sort of 1998 onwards, which followed individuals over time and collected data on them. So we can start to use these kinds of data. Unfortunately, it is something of a fossil record, in the sense that from the data that Essex holds and the multinational time use data set, you've got these points in time for at least these countries. Actually, there's rather more countries in this, but these are the ones I'm going to show a little bit of data on. You can see how over time it's got better, and for the UK, these are the longitudinal ones that I've been involved in at the end here. So there's 3 sets of data. I haven't got Susan's listed on here. She'll introduce her own, which we're using. Paul's using an additional one as well. And all of these were put together, by and large, for academic research and applied research purposes. The latter two actually came to see an investment by BT, which actually I was kind of partly responsible for because I worked there at the time. I convinced them to spend money on it. Now, this is a picture taken from a time use survey conducted in 2005 by the ONS, and just gives a rough picture of what men and women in full-time, part-time, unemployed, and retired and other inactive lifestyles spend their time doing. So it just gives you a broad picture of they take out sleep, unemployed women sleep more. Now, the thing to remember about this kind of data, and what you don't see on here, is what's the variance. So that's an average. Okay. In fact, the variation in these groups could be something like this. So you do have to bear that in mind when you look at these kinds of results. But it gives you a picture of the sorts of profiling you can start to do about what kinds of things different kinds of people might be doing during the day. Now, using that same data set, it's also published by the ONS, you can look at patterns of media use, that's TV actually, for men and social activities and hobbies and games over the age range. So immediately you're starting to see certain kinds of things that do or don't happen over age groups. Now, of course, some of that might be a cohort effect. This lot might stay like this as they get older. That lot might have always watched more television. But in amongst that, you've also got the ageing process as well. Okay. And we need to be able to unpack some of these. Now, looking at time use, media time use, this is data from a survey I was involved in over there were 6 countries actually, I picked out 3 for you. So we've got reading, we've got TV and video, it dominates, and then in 2002, I wouldn't say that, but it actually was 2002, you've got that little wodge there, which is this collection of computing-related time use activities. And you can see at that point in time, it was very much dominated by television. It still is very much dominated by television. But if our theories about the e-society are true, we should see some of this starting to move down into here. We may see some of this disappearing, except, of course, the activity of watching television, the activity of reading newspapers, gaining information, is simply done using a device which delivers it via the internet. So in a sense, that is being subsumed as a category of activity in amongst these experiences. And it's that kind of change that we've got to think about. I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll make it clearer for you. I'm going to step back, like Kimberly's arrived, because I'm going to use the multinational time use data set, the MTUS, to talk about some of the trends over time that we've been picking up in this piece of research. And we're going to look at work, we're going to look at civic duties, volunteering and so on, because of the implications that has for the idea of social capital. We're going to look at media use, because of the implications that has for industry and so on. And we're going to look at social time for the same reason as we perhaps want to look at civic duties, which is the flip side of social capital, the formal and the informal. First of all, if we look at work time, going back to the 1970s, you've got 5 countries here. Colleagues of mine who live in the Netherlands say this is undoubtedly true, working more. But trends in the UK, for example, appear relatively flat. Now again, you do have to worry a little bit about what's the variance around here. But in general, some of these trends you can take be reasonably confident about them. Now, what I want to do now is just to unpick that UK one. So I said a little bit earlier about the leisure society. Well, what's actually been happening? If you break it out by income brackets, so this is the lowest 25%, that's the middle classes, that's the top 25%. This lot are still working as much as they ever were, but you have underwork here. Part of the reason they're in that income bracket, of course. But essentially what you have got is a greater divide between the work and the worked and the workless, the work poor in society, and that divide appears to be widening. There's some very good research going on at ICER, University of Essex, using not TAMI's data, but other kinds of data, which can show this is exactly what is happening. So you're having an increased divide, and in fact, it's got worse since 1997. Now let's look a little bit at civic duties. This is the idea of doing unpaid volunteering work outside the home, the sort of things that perhaps Putnam was referring to a little bit in some of his work. And you can see in the UK that it kind of stays relatively static. Now, Paul and I go backwards and forwards about whether you can trust this data and whether it's actually true, and we might say a few words about this later on. But there is a huge wobble there, probably due to the size of the sample surveys in this data. But if you look, for example, and it's quite interesting that I picked this up, given that we're here at the ippr, who introduced Putnam to the British Political Society, because you do, in fact, pick up some sort of collapse and revival of this, at least this measure of social capital in the States over that period of time. I don't know whether I trust this data or not, but it's quite interesting to see that fact. So you can see how, over time, things may or may not have been changing at this macro measurement level, right, this really aggregated level. We can look at TV and radio. In fact, if you unpick this, you don't see a decline in radio. Well, you did through the 70s and 80s, but it's picking back up again now. And in particular, if you look at the growth of radio as a secondary activity, so in other words, whilst people are doing something else, the growth of things like iPod, Walkmans and all that has actually brought radio back to the fore in sort of transport and travel cultures. So you don't see too much change over time there. In terms of reading, interestingly in the Netherlands, you do see a decline as measured by this kind of data. But I think you'll probably agree, by and large, we don't see much in the way of significant changes. And this is social time, sort of entertainment, leisure, and so on. And in the UK, you see a similarly flat line. You may see some variance from the States. So what do we take from all of this stuff? Not just this aggregate level stuff, but also more longitudinal analyses that we've been doing, which tell the same sort of story. Well, we're not seeing anything that looks like a revolution here. But what we are seeing is something that looks rather like a background low-level evolution of behaviour with technologies. So we're seeing relatively micro-level qualitative changes to the way people are doing things that don't show up in this kind of data. Why don't they show up? Well, there's a number of reasons. Bearing in mind that we're looking at history here, maybe the things we care about haven't happened yet. Maybe if we had better data now, or over the last 1 to 2 years, we might be seeing these sorts of changes. Maybe we're measuring it with a wrong kind of like granularity here. Is this too aggregate? Probably it is. We might see something different later. The level of analysis is right. These kinds of TAMI's diary data is actually getting us to where we want to be. Is it measuring the kinds of things we want to see changing? Is it quite likely that it isn't? Do we have problems with semantic drift? And what I mean by that is, to give you an example, if you look at TAMI's data over time, it seems to be quite clear that certain kinds of activities are now being reported more than they used to do. But some of that is because it's now politically correct to say that you're doing it, like men doing childcare, for example. So how do you unpack those two things? They're undoubtedly doing more, but it's also more important that one should say that to an interviewer as well, for one's own self-esteem. So you have to unpack these two problems. But mostly, the problem, we think, is that we're not thinking about this right. I'll explain why we're not thinking about this right. We need to make sense of it in this way here. We want to use a term that J. Gashuni describes, which is modes of provision. How do you achieve the things you're doing? How does it get to you? How does food get to you? How do you achieve political participation? How do you achieve social communication? We have a process of domestication of these technologies, and we adapt our behaviour to them and with them. And in fact, there's a reflexive process there, which I'll talk about in a second. We need to think about it in terms of new ways to do old things and interaction, not impact. So in other words, what happens is that we see ways to do things using these technologies to perhaps make things more efficient, easier to do, whatever, and it also leads to new behaviours that are not apparent at that macro measurement level. It's these qualitative micro changes that I'm talking about. But most importantly of all, the impact model, the chicken and the egg, it really doesn't get us very far. We've got to stop looking for the chicken. Why? Well, this is the simple chicken model. Doesn't matter which is the chicken, which is the egg. Here's some behaviour meandering along. Here comes some sort of thing, intervention, technology, whatever. Bang! Over there, in the pocket it goes. Some sort of outcome. Well, I'm sorry, guys, but the world is not that simple. It's not even this simple, actually. There's lots of behaviours going on. They wobble around each other. There's perturbations when people see things. People see the affordances of something which might change the way they behave. That might get reflected back by a smart company who says, aha, they're doing something I haven't expected. Let's change it. Let's do it differently, which changes something over here. That might be a disruption. They might start doing something slightly differently. Suppose, for example, that they started doing shopping in two different ways. One, walking up and down Covent Garden, and the other using what's actually a new form of catalogue shopping, e-commerce. So what's happened is that some of it's been disrupted, but other bits haven't. Okay? But it's actually rather more complicated than this. Because you have all sorts of feedback loops between different behaviours, services, objectives, policies. You've got all kinds of interesting activity here with unanticipated usages, where what happens here gets reflected back either through innovation over there or innovation over here. Now this is, I would say, an evolutionary system model. Why? Well, I used to be a biologist and it looks very similar to the kinds of models I used to play with. But of course this probably will depress most people. Because if we're realistic about this, we don't actually know who our users are going to be or what they're going to do. We don't really know how we're going to make money, if you're interested in that. We don't really know what the outcome of our intervention or policy modelling is going to be. It becomes rather tricky. Which, to my mind, is fantastic because it means business cases will usually be wrong and you shouldn't bother with them. On the other hand, of course, they're very useful for thinking through the rationale for what you're doing, but be sure it'll be wrong. Okay? Now, it's okay. There are ways of thinking about this. Several ways of thinking about this. We can think about them in terms of evolutionary systems, and there's some methods and models that we can use there. We can think about them in terms of complex systems, and there's some really good work going on at the moment in understanding the NHS interventions, the complex system that involves patient, doctors, the whole structure of the NHS, and the technological investments that are being made, and what might happen over time with that. Beta World. Who does know about Beta World? Okay, it's the world going on here. If you don't know who your users are, you chuck it out, see what they do with it. When you work out what they do with it, you pour lots of money into it and invest in it. And that's all very well, where your production costs are very low. But supposing you're about to rewire the country, you can't do that in Beta World, can you? So you've got to have a rather better idea about what might happen over time. But for those of you for whom that is all rather disturbing and tricky, if you really, really, really can't do without certainty, well, you pay them enough, they'll always give it to you, won't they?
Great. Okay, thank you, Ben. Okay, do we have any questions to kick off with first off? Okay, Ben, I've got one. So obviously our analytical tools aren't actually measuring what's really happening. How do you think they can be fine-tuned? Because, I mean, if you're designing, for example, e-government services, I mean, how on earth do you justify this expenditure and money if we don't actually know what's going on?
Quite. Sorry.
Thanks.
No, well, look, I'm going to say something which will enable me to keep my job and be a researcher forever and ever, right? There are a number of different things you can do, and I think the key to it is actually something that probably Susan's going to show you, which is multiple methods. So you need to put together a number of different ways of looking at the same issue, the same problem, the same service, the same intervention, the same policy, whatever it is, the same strategy. And I think, in fact, the way that certain kinds of, let's say, policy interventions, which are what services are being used in trials, is exactly the thing to do, because that's Beta World. So what you're doing is you're saying, we're putting this out there because we have this bunch of knowledge that might be the grey literature, it might be academic literature, it might be some modelling that we've done, which says we think it might work like this. So we're going to try it. We're going to try and do it probably as cheaply as we can to see what happens. When we get some feel for where this is going, we can do two things. In fact, you should be doing one of them right early on, which is the participation of the users. what you need to be able to do is to get this co-design bit working. Now, this isn't particularly new in the ICT world. User-centered design, for example, thinks about how do you engage the people in the process of the production of the thing, whether it's a mobile phone or a device or a service or a strategy or whatever it is. Because it enables you then to build in, it creates a tension between two things. One of which is delivering them something that does what they already want to do, which is probably not necessarily what you want, but engaging them in a process of change so that they end up doing what it is that you do want them to do. Now that can be buying Mars bars if you want to sort of move them off something onto Mars bars, but in the case of other kinds of services, you're moving them off, let's say, telephony provision of a contact centre to something else. But you've got to get them using one before you can drag them over to another. Think about this in designing work systems in large organisations, which is where this process is quite familiar. There's a distinct tension between designing it so that it works for those workers and doesn't disrupt their ways of working, because if it does, the whole company is going to go down the pan. But also creating the tension that migrates those work practices to something which is actually what you want to achieve in the long term. And that reflects some of the power play in organisations is not actually technology for technology's sake, it's technology for changing dynamics of power, which is actually what it's often about. How do you do the studies? I think you have to do multiple methods. So you might involve things like actually logging usage of the system. Where are people going? Why is it breaking down? Catching those breakdowns, seeing what those people are doing. And then doing that also with more survey-style work, maybe even diary-style work. So you can mix these different methods together. Because I don't think any one of them gives you the purchase on the problem. I think you have to look at it at multiple levels of granularity, multiple levels of analysis. That was long.
Can you just introduce yourself and where you're from as well before?
Keep it right from BT. Okay, it's interesting your comment about the business cases. Does that suggest that actually we're doing business cases wrong? That we should be doing a different scope of the business cases, perhaps?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, my experience of doing business cases is quite limited. But having been involved in some, when I did work for a large corporate, having been involved in others as a kind of consultant advisor, the process of going through a sort of a rationale for launch is absolutely required because it can iron out some of the really silly things. But it's always, I think it's going to be a mistake to assume it will get the revenue the way you think it will. And I think that's becoming more and more the case because technology services are more malleable. By malleable, I mean they're more open to users doing things that you haven't anticipated. The old telephone, you could do one thing, you can make a call. Right? The mobile phone is actually quite simple because that's how it starts off in people's heads. And you're migrating people into new services. Give someone a laptop and some knowledge and they can do a lot of different things with it. That's what I mean by malleability. So as we see more malleable technologies and services, we're likely to see more unpredictability and therefore perhaps more of a beta world situation. But that doesn't help someone who's doing infrastructure with huge costs. And I think there's modelling work that one can do which has, let's say, margins of error. Maybe even we could do some more complex modelling, evolutionary modelling. I think that would work. But those tools aren't really there yet. Certainly the sort of relatively simplistic things which sort of add up the things we can sell and the price we think we can sell them, have them there, and it says, oh, do we worry about the time it might take to use that to get us that revenue? No. And we won't worry that it will take time from over here, which we're also making revenue out of. So the old thing about TV advertising, is it going to switch to the internet because people get broadband and so on and so on.
Any other questions? I've got another one actually, sorry.
You've done your 20 minutes,
yeah? 3 minutes. It strikes me that a lot of people, when they're participating in online activities in particular, are actually participating in quite civic-based community action, whether it be writing a blog for their community or, that's actually pointing out things that are wrong with the area or, where you can get the latest recycling, technology, whatever it might be. And this kind of activity doesn't seem to be included in our definition of civic duties. Do you think we need to redefine what we mean by civic duties for a digital age?
I don't think it isn't. Sorry, too many negatives. I think it is included because the way one should address the research problem is doing civic acts. How you're achieving those acts is a different issue. So I'm doing it through a website, or I'm doing it down the pub, or I'm doing it over the phone, or I'm doing it whatever. I think that's an infrastructure kind of question, which goes along with the what are you actually doing sort of question. And in fact, some of the time use diaries that the ONS have been doing lately have been doing that rather well, because they're asking you what you're doing, and then they're asking you how you're achieving that. Some of that data, actually, I'll show you later, just the uses you can put to it. But I think that conceptual separation is really important. But that's also important for things like TV. We're all going to keep watching TV, but how it's delivered to us is different. It's going to change. You know, whether it's piped up in the road or over the airwaves or whatever. Yeah? But we should make sure we can separate the experience from how it's delivered to us.
Okay.